Hi guys, welcome back to Missy's Imaginings. The last video was drafting the pattern for a gown for the Resinsoul 60 centimeter body. My doll's name is Elise, and so I got that all done. So today we're going to be putting that together. But I also have a little bit of other news. For Jack, I wanted him to have something a little bit more casual and informal. So I drafted a pattern of ninja pants, and I don't know what the actual name for these would be called because I literally just Googled ninja pants and found some pictures and was able to kind of get an idea of what I wanted to do there. So they have the dropped crotch, see it's way down here. This pair does just have a drawstring waist because I was still experimenting, but it does have inset pockets. So he's got two front inset pockets, and the fly does actually have a fly. And this one isn't terribly long, so it doesn't really gap, which was nice. And yeah, they went together pretty well. And then I also did a tank top for him. So let's go ahead and take the coat off. So I got the tank top done. And I used a cotton fabric for the pants just because that's what I had that was long enough for his legs. This fabric I also have some, but the grain goes the opposite direction, so it wouldn't have worked for the pants. So anyhow, the pants are just cotton. I used like a two-way stretchy fabric for the tank top, and I posted some pictures in a couple different Facebook groups. So yeah, so here's his pants and a tank top, just kind of the cut-in back on the tank top. And yeah, so I was real happy to get that all done for him. So he's got just a little bit more of a casual look. I think I'm still going to tweak the pants a little bit so they're full here, but not quite as full in the actual waist. So I'll probably take those in a little bit, but with a drawstring they can work. So anyway, so that's a little bit of extra news. So I got this outfit done for Jack, so I was excited about that. And that pattern will be probably coming soon. Like I said, I just might tweak it a little bit to get more of a little shape that I wanted to go with him. But the dress that we're doing today, and it's kind of a cheat, right, to show it before we sew it, but I got it all done and then realized the video would be too long. So this is the gown. I showed it a little bit at the end of the last video, so we're going to go ahead and put that together. And then the beads on the gown, I didn't actually put them on the gown. I just did a crystal necklace that she can wear so it drapes in the back rather than the front. So it gives kind of a choker look in the front and then drapes in the back. And then just use some diamonds to kind of put in her hair. Not diamonds, but you know. And they kind of they're sliding out. But anyway, so I was real happy with how that turned out. Another thing, I'm going to say a big, huge thank you to Sarah from Pint Size Palace. She posted a video, and I'll put the link below, that was super helpful on wiring your dolls. This doll and Jack, both the Resinsoul, because they're really long and really slim, really lanky, they were really kicky and their knees buckle really easy. So Sarah has a video on wiring your dolls, and it's awesome because now her elbows don't kick at all and her knees don't buckle. There we go. So I can position them in different places and they don't kick, and she can sort of stand if I'm careful, because there again, she is really tall, so you have to really balance the ankles. Let's see if we can get her to stand. I'll turn her face a little bit. And she's on a towel here, which is also a little lumpy, but let's see here. And you can't really wire the ankles, but her knees don't buckle. Before, if you tried to do that, her knees would just buckle and she'd just fall over. So you couldn't even attempt to make her stand. So there we go. But in any event, so a big thank you to Sarah for that information. And the wire that I used, I got at Dollar Tree. It comes on a card. It's just floral wire, but it's a nice, fairly heavy wire, yet it's real easy to bend, and it comes in pretty colors. So if it shows, let's see if I can get it to show in her elbow. I don't know if it'll show through because of her elastic, but like this one is, the wire is actually, oh, I don't know if it'll show there. It's purple. So she has her purple markings and everything, and the wire that I used to wire her is purple, which is really cool. And then Jack's, I didn't have any blue, but it was red. So it's pretty. So that way if it shows through, you've got a pretty color instead of just, you know, gray or that florist green. You know, so anyway, it's pretty, it's shiny, and it worked really, really well. I think I'll still wire her fingers a little bit again with a heavier gauge. But anyway, so that's the scoop of where we are. The new project's coming. I still have the vinyl dolls that I'm going to do basic sets for. And so yeah, so now that all that news is out of the way, we'll go ahead and start sewing the gown. So now that it's time to sew, I will mention just a little bit about how I cut these pieces. The center front was lined up on a fold with the grain of the fabric. That leaves the outside edge cut on a bias because of the angle. So then when I cut the back pieces, I also have the center back with the grain of the fabric to make sure that that side is still cut on a bias. That just kind of helps those to line up and sew together a little bit better. If you sew something that's cut on a bias with something that's sewn on a straight grain, sometimes that pull that comes more freely on the bias cut will prevent those from matching up, and you can get kind of some wonky curves in your seams. So I always try to make sure that if something is cut on the bias, when I sew it together, I sew it to a piece that was cut the same way. I also left the mill end edge on this fabric. It's very narrow, and I'm not sure if it'll show up that there's, you know, the milled edge and little holes in it. That's just the edge of the fabric, but I take advantage of that when I can, because that's going to be sewn and turned in, so it won't show on the finished garment, and it just, that way I don't have to serge that edge, and it just prevents more bulk, so it keeps it nice and flat. I won't have to worry about it fraying, and I just take advantage of that whenever I can. If this mill end is real narrow like this one, it just saves work and bulk in the garment. So I'm going to sew these together. I probably won't have continual footage of all the sewing just to save on time, but I'm just going to sew the side seams of the skirt together. So I just sewed those together and serged the seams so they'll be nice and finished. The next step I'm going to work on is the actual bodice. So we'll put this to the side. Now on the bodice, as I mentioned when I cut everything out, these two pieces are going to be gathered, but they're going to be gathered a little bit differently. This one will be gathered to actually fit the doll's bust. This one will be gathered to match the gathered piece here. So that's what we're going to do next. You can run a hand stitch through there, but I like to use the machine when I'm gathering just so that my stitches are even and it makes the gather look a little bit better. On my machine, because this is doll clothing, if I was going to gather people clothing, I would put it on the longest stitch, which on my machine is a 5. But because it's doll clothing and it doesn't have as, you know, long of a piece, I'm not going to go that far. I'm only going to take it to a 4, which is still a nice basting stitch, but it's just not as long. On a doll garment, if you have really long basting stitches, the gathering's going to look a little weird because the gathers are going to be bigger. You know, how do I explain that? The ruffling isn't going to be nice and tight like you would want on a doll item. The other thing to remember, again, if you're gathering and if you're a new sewer, is don't trim your threads, because you need to be able to hold on to those. Now, because this is going to be fitted and it's going to take a little work, I'm going to go ahead and tie this end of my threads. I'm just gonna, I could just do a little slip knot, I guess. Might be the easiest way. Wrap it around my finger and take it through, because I want one end to be fixed so that I know once I gather it, it's not gonna move. And so the best way I can do a slip knot is I put my tweezers through the loop, and then if I go ahead and take that and pull it down, then my knot will be close to where I'm actually tying it off, instead of ending up with the loop way up here. That's just a little trick I discovered by accident. So now the other thing when I'm gathering, I always gather by taking the top thread, and the reason I do that is so that when the finished garment is gathered, if some of that thread were to poke through, it's not going to be big lumps that's left on the back side, because this side will be nice and tight. So I'm going to gather this fabric just by pulling the top thread and gathering that fabric onto it. And I'm being careful because this fabric will tend to fray, so you don't want to fray out all your fabric. So now I want to make sure that this is going to actually fit the doll. So what we're going to do is I'm going to place this right where I'm going to sew. So I'm going to have it fitted right here. I've got a seam allowance under the bust, and that's where it's going to fit. And it looks like I've pretty much got it where I want it. It could be a little more snug, but it looks like that's going to fit pretty well. Pull it just a little more snug and adjust my gathers so they look nice. And this is going to be the inside piece, so I'm going to make sure that fits across the top. It's not too tight. It comes down on the sides the way I want. So now what I'm going to do is take and tie. Well, I'm not going to tie, but I'm going to sew, because if you tie it, you'll just pull the back and it'll change your gathers. So I'm going to stay stitch this gathering just to hold it in place. And I want to adjust some of these little ruffles. So even with this size, you kind of want to, there we go. So it looks like it's pretty balanced as far as where the ruffles are on the thread. That fit her exactly the way I wanted it to now. So I'm going to baste, well, now I'm going to stay stitch, which is just back to my regular stitch. So I put the machine back on the little stitch for doll clothing, and I'm going to sew that edge. All of the gathering and the stay stitching is inside the 1/4 inch seam allowance, because I don't want it to show up later. Gonna try to sew this with the doll on my lap. That out, and those stitches, since it's just stay stitching, I am going to trim. They're not going to go anywhere. Alright, so now that's got a little bit more of a staying power, and it's curved the way I want it. So this piece is the lining. Now I'm going to gather this piece by doing the same thing. So now, before I gather this, I'm going to fold it in half and mark the center with a pin, just because there's a little more length, and I want to make sure this, because this is the actual front of the gown, I want to make sure that my gathers are lined up and that the center front is the center front. So I'm going to put a pin in there, and now I'm going to go ahead and gather by once again pulling the top thread. If I can get hold of it. And the pin will just stay there, it's not going to hurt anything. Okay, there we go. So it's getting that gathered look that I wanted. Okay, and then before I actually start stay stitching this, on this piece I also need to gather the bottom edge, which I probably should have sewn that before, but I remember these things too late sometimes. So there we go. So that's going to be the top edge, and then I'm going to gather the bottom because this length has to match this length. And now I'm going to go ahead and prepare the cap sleeves. So on the cap sleeves, I'm simply going to fold good sides on the inside, and I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to stitch around this edge and turn it inside out. Now these I don't serge because the seam will all be inside and it won't ever show again, so I'm not going to worry about serging it because it would just add more bulk to the fabric. So I usually only try to serge seams that are going to end up showing because I want it to be nice and finished. So if I know it's going to be totally hidden, then I don't worry about that. Alright, so here are the sleeves. Now I'm going to go ahead and baste across the bottom because these do need to be slightly gathered at the bottom. And because they're so short, I'm going to only use a 3.5 rather than a 4 measurement. So it won't be a tiny, or it won't be a giant basting stitch. But it'll still be small enough that I'll be able to kind of scrunch that up as I need to. And I'm going to baste across all 4 of the ends. Okay, and now I'm going to actually take one end of the thread and once again I'll tie it. This one's a little bit shorter, so I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm going to loop twice, and then I'll loop twice again. Just hold that still. Then I'm going to take one of the threads and go ahead and gather it, but I'm going to scrunch it up all the way. And you can kind of then do it on both ones. So then it'll look like this. I'm just going to scrunch it all the way and then tie that. And I'm going to do that to all 4 ends. And I'll tie the threads and then trim them off. Now I'm putting my pieces together for the actual corset because this is an ultra leather fabric and it's a little bit thick. I'm not going to line it because I know it won't fray, and this is a nice soft fabric inside. So I'm going to go ahead and put these pieces together. I'm starting with the center pieces, lining up the center front. The little notches are the top, So they're going to be the top of the corset. I'm going to go ahead and put these together with a 1/4 inch seam. Then I'll open that up, and next I will go ahead and put in the front side. So the front side curves this way, is going towards the front, so these two pieces will go together. And here, because they kind of curve away from each other, I go ahead and start my seam just with a little back tack. Make sure that doesn't come around, and then I go ahead and I just bring these together as I sew, just kind of fooling the machine into thinking that I'm sewing a straight seam rather than trying to match up those curves, and then they go together really well. Go. So instead of trying to take two curves that are going the opposite direction, trying to match them up, putting them in the machine, I just bring those together as I sew, so that as it goes into the machine, it's like sewing a straight line. And that seems to work for me. So if that's not something you already know and say, yeah, Missy, duh, it's something fun to try. So here again, I'm going to start at the top and see how these curve away from one another. So I'll just bring those together as I sew the seam. Here's a small note for people who might be new to sewing, that you might freak out when you see this piece is a lot longer than the other. And the key is to looking to where the pieces come together. Your seam should be right to where the V, where those pieces overlap. So having extra seam allowance here is not a big deal, that this is a different measurement here. And you can kind of tell that I knew this seam was going to start about here. My bottom lines up just like I wanted to. So don't worry about this seam allowance being longer, and don't try to start with the tip of this down here. You want to look at the entire length of what's actually being sewn, because the seam allowance, let's see if I can get a pencil in here. The seam allowance on your pattern would look like this on this piece. So you just want to see that where this seam allowance line and this one would cross, your seam allowance on the other piece, of course, would be here. So this is actually just perfect. So it's okay for this to be extra, because it's just extra seam allowance that'll be trimmed out later. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch all of these seams open. So I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm just top stitching very close to the seam all the way up to the top into the seam allowance. Then I'm going to go across the seam, and then I'm going to come back down the other side and open my seam allowance again. And that's just top stitching, that's not holding anything together, and it's going to be covered up later, so there we go, I'm not going to worry. So both of my seam allowances are open, and I'm just going to top stitch up one side and down the other. And that's what I'm going to do on each one of these seams. here is the corset pieces. So now I want to make sure that this longer piece gathered section is going to match this gathered section. So I'm going to lay it over the top and just see how it's fitting, because I want that to be about the same. So let's see if that's going to match. So there we go. Looks like it will be pretty close of a match. So now that I know this is about to match that, I can adjust a little bit when I actually put them together. I'm going to take the lining piece and my little shoulder seams, and I'm going to put them in right at the very bottom, leaving for a seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and pin those right in there with the seam of that shoulder on the inside there. Hold it down. So I'm going to pin those right at the bottom except for a seam allowance. So I want them right at the very bottom, right where that's going to connect to the corset pieces. When we go ahead and put those in, they're going to be right at the bottom except for a seam allowance. Then I'm going to match my centers, and again these are pinned to the good side, and now I'm going to match good sides to this piece, and I want to find the center of that lining piece. I'm going to line these up so I find the center of this one as well. There it is, and that's what I'm going to match with my pin that marked the center of the longer piece. There we go. I'm going to pin the centers together. And then I'm going to make sure that my little shoulder straps are out of the way and laying flat with that seam allowance right there. I'm going to pin on the outside of the shoulder strap, making sure it's not in the way of the seam. Then I'm going to lift out the pin that's holding that little shoulder strap in place, and I'm going to go ahead and take that out and pin through all the layers. So I'm pinning the lining, the shoulder, and the shoulder straps and the front. And then I'm going to pin again on the other side of that shoulder strap, because I just want to keep those in place so that I don't have it buckle inside and end up sewing, like, you know, the front of the shoulder piece up inside the neckline or something like that. So then I match up my gatherings. And pin that edge together. Looks like it's going to be a really good match, so that's a good thing. There we go. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and sew those two pieces together, taking a 1/4 inch seam. So there we go. Shoulder straps down at the bottom of that edge. Now the next step is to gather this bottom edge of the long piece to match the length of the lining piece. So here again I've basted, and I'm going to go ahead and tug on that and gather that up so it matches. that edge. And I'm going to leave about 3/4 of an inch that's not gathered, just kind of the edge of the front side there. So about a 3/4 of an inch. I'm not going to take the gathers that far back. So pin those edges together. And then I'm going to distribute the gathers in what remains. Probably 3 pins between the other two just to keep my gathers evenly distributed there. There we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and stay stitch across that edge. There we go. So I did go ahead and serge the bottom edge just because that is going to be attached to the corset. So now that this is done and this is done, we're going to go ahead and line up the center of our front to the center of the corset. And I'm not going to pin that, instead I'm going to clip it, because once you put holes in the ultra leather, you can't take them out. So I'm not going to pin that, just to make sure that my pins are not making holes I don't want. So now I'm going to go ahead and sew the top bodice piece to the corset piece, and I'm going to go ahead and follow right at a 1/4 inch along this edge that I already sewed, and then that will attach the top bust part to the corset. Now that that's in place, I'm going to trim off all those little pieces that were sticking up, because now I don't need to mark the top anymore. So I'm going to get rid of some of that. And this piece here, I'm going to trim that off. There we go. And now I'm going to turn this over a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to go ahead and actually sew it down, which will also put top stitching, because this is going to fold down. So it's going to end up with top stitching all the way around the corset, and that will also be taking this seam allowance down and sewing it down. And because I need to be able to see and make sure this is all folded down, I'll probably do it from the inside. So that's going to be the top of the bust there, and then this is going to be around the waist. So we're going to go ahead and top stitch this. So I'll fold this in, well, I'm not going to do that edge yet, just because I need to sew the skirt to it. So I'm only going to do the top edge. I'm not going to worry about the sides yet. Here we go. So there's the front of the bust and the shoulder straps, and then this will come around to the back. So the next step is to sew on the skirt. And here I want to see, I'm going to need to gather just a little because I want this to match this. So I'm going to run a basting stitch across the top. And I'm going to clip the edge to my ultra leather. And I'm going to sew those together. So now the skirt is attached to the corset part. So now I'm going to once again take this seam allowance up and I'm going to top stitch on the outside. Oh, and I did serge that edge just so that the fabric would be finished. So next I'm going to serge the bottom edge, well, and I'll sew the back seam together, and I'm going to leave it till about here. So I'm going to leave about 2 inches unsewn. The next step is to go ahead and sew this edge down. So I'm going to leave it inside out, and I'm going to fold these back and just stitch down, across, and then up the other side. now we'll turn it right side out. And see how it fits. Here's the dress all finished. It's a little big around the corset, so if I do it again, I'll probably take those and make them a little smaller, make the pieces a little smaller, and then it would tighten that up around her midriff a little bit. Let's see if I can turn her without her falling down. And the back looks like this. So as you can see, it's a little big. I may just fold it in, and it'd be a little bit bulky in the back, but then it'll fit better. So that's probably what I will do for this dress, just so that I can still use it. So there we go. She's all done. So here's what she looks like in her gown. I actually have it all finished, pressed now, so got the wrinkles out. So this is what the gown looks like. Now that I fixed the back, I just took the back in, I just folded that in and tacked it. I probably still need to do something a little different with the clasp because it shows and I really don't like that. But the fit is better. The dress has a lot of alterations you could make and changes. If you want the back to be more closed, you can bring those pieces in a little bit more. If you want the skirt to be more full, you could simply widen or cut extra pieces to put in and then actually have more gathers by where the corset comes down. If you don't want as much fullness in the bust, you could use the smaller piece for both the front and the lining. You could take the cap sleeves off. There's just lots of things you could play with. This pattern I will probably go ahead and have available to purchase. Not because I'm stingy, but it takes a lot of batteries making these videos. So if I can gain a little bit of pennies for a couple of my patterns, then that kind of helps with batteries and getting things printed. So yeah, I'll have this available for sale, and you can purchase this pattern. And there's also the pattern for the long black gown is on my website, and I think it's available on eBay as well. So for the long black with gold that she was wearing earlier. So those two are available to purchase. Her basic pieces set has already been posted on the website. So if you go to Missy'sImaginings.com, go to the ready to print page, you can go ahead and download the free PDF that is the basic piece set for this doll, and that set did include the bonus of the corset that goes all the way around. So you'll have those pieces to make alterations and change. So here she is, my little reluctant princess, and I'm happy now with her new face up because her head matches her body, her new gown, and I'm not sure if she's going to keep the white hair, but she will for a while. I did order, there was a sale I saw on a Facebook group for some Monique Mallory wigs that are real wavy. I ordered two. I couldn't resist. One is a burgundy and the other is going to be an almost black. So I'm not sure if she'll end up with them or she'll keep the white, but somebody will wear them. So I was happy they were on sale. That was nice. And it was at audreysdolls.com, I guess. I don't remember the exact name or spelling, but I Googled and got there and found the wigs. So I'm not sure how long the sale is going on, but if you want to check out that sale, I'll go ahead and get the link for sure and put it in the description. You can see how if the sale is still going. So anyway, yeah, she's all done. So thanks for coming. Sorry this one took so long, but just to put the pieces all together and to get them cut out and then to actually sew it at the same time was just going to be too long. So I went ahead and split it into 2 videos. So thanks for coming, and happy sewing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.